Yes, thank you so much. We are now moving on to the panel discussion. The way we're going to be doing it is that since Jennifer said that, she has delivered the talk, she's very interested in the reactions that our two panelists have, as well as you, to the talk that she gave. And before that, I wanted to read to you our two panelists' bios. NiCole Buchanan, PhD, to my left, is a professor at Michigan State University. She researches the interplay of race, gender, and victimization and how they impact the nature of harassment, its impact, and organizational best practices. I have a feeling it's even more pessimistic and terrible for you than when you only have one. Intersectionality kills you, doesn't it? She also studies faculty of color and ways in which their research is marginalized, that is, epistemic exclusion. She has been highlighted in hundreds of media outlets, is a featured speaker, including TEDx and National Public Radio, and provides bias and diversity-related training and consultation. Example, medical professionals, faculty, clinicians, human resource managers, and police departments. Dr. Buchanan is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, 4 divisions of the American Psychological Association, Society of Clinical Psychology, Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, Society for the Psychological Study of Ethnic Minority Issues, and Society for the Psychology of Women. And she has received national and international awards for her research, teaching, and professional service. And we have, in addition to NiCole Buchanan, on Zoom, NiCole Bedera, PhD, and I'm very happy to say that I was her dissertation advisor here at the University of Michigan. So I even know the university, what it was and all that, but I won't tell. She's a sociologist, she's amazing, and author of the forthcoming book, On the Wrong Side, How Universities Betray Survivors to Protect Perpetrators of Sexual Assault. Her scholarship has influenced sexual violence prevention programming across the United States, and her work has been featured in many popular outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, and Teen Vogue. To put her research into action, NiCole is also an affiliated educator with the Center for Institutional Courage and a co-founder for Beyond Compliance Consulting. If you get NiCole on something, woof, she'll take it through, and the pessimism about social change, she's one that will overcome it, I'm certain. She gives me hope about the future. And on that note, let me just ask both of you your reactions and comments regarding Jennifer's speech. Yes. Who wants to go first?
Would you like to go first? The other NiCole?
Sure. First of all, I thought it was a fantastic talk, and I'm so excited to kind of be here virtually. And one of my reactions was thinking about the role of gender bias in how that shapes institutional betrayal. In my scholarship, I was really interested in the guiding ideologies of administrators in these cases and the way they were shaped by the institution. And one of the things that I found was there's this public perception that the reason that institutional betrayal happens is because there's this distrust of survivors or this disdain for survivors. And I thought it was quite the opposite, that administrators were more interested in protecting perpetrators because they just thought it was unfair or they were uncomfortable with the types of ramifications that they pictured some kind of consequences would have on their lives. And this really gets into this philosophical concept of empathy, where we give more empathy in our society than men than to women. And so when administrators had to make these decisions, they sort of default empathized with perpetrators who were overwhelmingly men. And part of support for this finding was that when gender roles were reversed, and it was women who were in the role of respondent, they did not get the same kind of protective benefits. And so that's something I think we should be thinking about in changing policy and also in our conversations today, is the way gender bias is also present in these institutional proceedings, and that connection between institutional change and cultural shift as well. And NiCole, I'm excited to hear from you too.
Thank you for that. Absolutely, every time I hear Jennifer talk, I mean, this was just another example of a series of incredible work and incredible talks that really I find invigorating rather than demoralizing, perhaps because you end with institutional courage. And I caught the snicker as people heard I'm from MSU, who is yet embroiled in yet another sexual scandal, among one of at least 3 scandals that are ongoing at the moment. And it is demoralizing. And the institutional betrayals have been just racking up, for well over a decade. I was part of the 2014 task force looking at kind of doing a 360 on campus and looking at sexual assault on campus, and we created, 30 pages of recommendations for the university that was quickly buried. And months later, the Nassar case broke. So the idea that we were doing this work while the institution was hiding the Nassar case, was really intense. So the idea of institutional betrayal and what that looks like and how it can be overcome has been near and dear to my heart. What is clear to me is also that it really requires that the institution has the will to do it differently. And one of my concerns that your talk also highlighted for me was, and how fragile those changes can be. And that you have a change of leadership and you may have all of the work for a decade dismantled. And I've been seeing this over and over again in a variety of institutions where you may have that, and I'm a big advocate for getting leadership on board and for reminding leadership that they set the tone and they will be responsible for what happens and whether or not change occurs. But we also need to do a lot bit more in also getting those changes instituted in ways that can't be unraveled as soon as we have a change in leadership. And so hearing your example of so many good things done, and then the president changes, and that next president almost seems to be a reaction perhaps to that good work, and we've seen this at a national level as well, where there is a reactionary leader that comes in and not only undoes the work, but can really set the tone in a dramatically different direction. And so thinking about how do we not only create this institutional courage that is there in the moment, but that becomes regimented in ways that it cannot be so easily undone. And perhaps, although leadership sets the tone and they create the impetus for that change, doing more to spread those values throughout the organization so that if there is a change of leadership that tries to unravel them, it becomes much more difficult to do that because there's been this wide buy-in. And so perhaps that's a piece of where that next step needs to be happening. I think oftentimes we get excited about the changes that are happening, but if they can be unraveled, then it didn't go deep enough, it didn't go far enough in the work. And also, I was really fascinated in thinking so much about the discussion about where have our Title IX offices become housed and what does that look like, and thinking about not only the gender bias, but as I think about what's happened in some recent cases that I'm privy to, one, seeing how the support and the value for the victim in this case, or the survivor in this case, and seeing how once the perpetrator filed suit against the university, everything flipped. And the support and the concern, and even if you track the emails and look at the responses, the hostility and the switch in those responses changed almost at the moment that the perpetrator filed suit against the institution. And then the outcomes and everything fell in line with protecting the institution at that point. And so really resonating with this idea of we need a new system, and we need a system that is taking it so it's no longer a direct benefit to the institution to hide these cases or to protect themselves. And, but also thinking as I always do, complicate the question, and looking at the gender biases we see, one of the cases in particular that I'm hearkening to, there's also racial biases. There were biases related to country of origin and somebody who was a naturalized citizen here, and also language, and being able to weaponize either a misuse of a word or a word that perhaps has a different connotation and the translation didn't quite take, the unwillingness to spend the time to translate documents and to have that done professionally, and all these things that are embedded in how these systems work that are layering on additional harms, additional betrayals, and really highlighting the fact that we devalue certain members of our community, and the way that they are being devalued, it falls along gendered lines, racial lines, country of origin, and language barriers. So how do we kind of complicate these pictures to really encompass those that are the most vulnerable among us and make sure that their needs are being served, and then as a result, all of our boats are lifted.
Wonderful comments. If I may add a sociological analysis to it. On the one hand, you have an institution. An institution, as you know, is extremely complex, houses thousands of people, mostly, and what are prominent in institutions are, even though us faculty are supposed to be self-governing, it's the administrators. And I think what happens is that administrators, as they move away from teaching and research, become experts of kinds that no longer connect to the rest of the faculty as such. So there's a certain amount of alienation that comes from holding a position of power over the rest. And on the one side you have the institution, on the other you have individuals, be they undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, staff. We deal with them as individuals. You cannot have individuals take on an institution. You have to have a community. So we cannot, as faculty, if we're treated alone as individuals, be able to do anything. For a social movement to happen, we have to be able to be mobilized because only then will we have enough social power to take on the administration and the institution. Is at least what I've learned. Not that I've been able to carry it out, but at least that's what social change literature tells us. So, NiCole, do you want to add anything more, or shall we turn to Jennifer? Yes, go ahead.
There was one thing that came up for me when listening to NiCole speaking, and that was thinking about how our definition of violence, something we encounter a lot in this work, is people reacting and saying, wow, I can't believe that you're considering something like sexual harassment to be violence. When we know as researchers that sexual harassment, specifically within an organizational context, can create the same kind of problems in that context, in that type of institutional betrayal, as rape or other types of violence that more people are likely to see as serious. And listening to NiCole's comments, one of the things that came up to me that I haven't published anywhere quite yet, I do have a book coming out very soon, but that was really apparent in talking to women of color who were experiencing institutional betrayal, was that our definitions of violence are not nearly broad enough. And that often their experiences of sexual harassment were not covered in any institutional policy. And I'll give you a really crystal clear example of this. All of the Black women in my study, which was an ethnography, the sample size is relatively small, but all of the ones who experienced sexual harassment at their university, it started from either a peer or a superior trying to claim credit for work that they did not do, trying to claim credit for work and expecting Black women to work for them without compensation or recognition. And if they refused to do that, that is what escalated into forms of sexual harassment the institution might recognize. And so I think as part of this work too, and thinking to the future, thinking about where those root causes of this type of violence comes from, and it often does come from other forces of inequality, of power disparities, and that they're also tightly interwoven, even though on college campuses in particular, we tend to break up those processes and say this one goes to Title IX, this one goes to Title VII. when really they can't be separated, and that creates additional barriers for the survivors who are now going through many, many different proceedings where their experiences aren't recognized in any of them. It's not just something that came up for me that I wanted to flag as well.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, do you want to please?
Yeah, is this on? Okay. Your comments both are just like, my mind is racing with ideas. Thank you so much. Just on the last topic, one of the things that, I mentioned I was so naive in 2013 when I had the data on institutional betrayal and the harm it was causing, and I took it to the university administration and thought that they would be like, oh, thank you for letting us know, we're going to fix this. And that wasn't the response I got. And in fact, I got a really defensive response. And I was not expecting that. I was just so naive because now I think anything that's really entrenched is serving some purpose in maintaining the status quo. And so there's going to be resistance to changing the status quo because then people who have power, think they have power, think they will get power, don't want to lose that power. So I think when we think about changing these systems, one of the difficult but important things to think about is how to confront that, whether it's to call it out and be explicit about it, or whether it's to find other ways to show people that they're actually, in making a change, not making their situation worse. And that's part of like the difficulty is figuring out how to get around that that responsiveness. And in terms of like the underlying role, I'm so glad you talked about this, the NiCole on the screen about the underlying root causes and the gender violence, and then NiCole sitting next to me, the intersectionality problem here, that social inequality is part of the status quo, right? And it's part of what people are resisting. And I didn't mention it in terms of citing the research we've done, but in many of our studies, we have looked at dimensions besides gender. And as you might expect, by and large, we see that whenever somebody's located, their social location is in one with less power, they're at higher risk for both sexual violence and institutional betrayal. One particularly fascinating finding, when we look specifically at sexual orientation, we find that that in our studies, that the male students who identified as not straight were at higher rates of being victims of sexual assault. But where we saw a remarkably large effect in terms of institutional betrayal was for the female students who identified as not straight. They were just much more likely to be victims of institutional betrayal. So here too you see this, some nuanced but powerful effect of social inequality playing out in these behaviors. And so then you have to kind of ask, well, how is the institutional betrayal helping the people who are in some sense, making it happen, even if what they're doing is just sort of on the surface following the rules? How is it serving their purposes and what role it's playing? I think once we uncover all that, we'll have better tools.
Thank you. I totally agree. Actually, in my case, my activism with respect to the acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide by Turkish state and society, who still deny it to this day, is what got me into activism, and that gave me the courage, basically, to take on inequities. And once I did that, it was very easy then to go from there to the University of Michigan and see the inequities here. And I guess my activism had given me the courage to move forward. But I did things very informally because I also thought, like you did, that they would acknowledge and say, oh my God, you're right, we'll do something about this. No, they're going in every different direction, and I do critical discourse analysis. I can take apart their, the rhetoric very easily, but it doesn't address. And now you told me about all the trauma I should have accumulated by now, but I probably normalized and naturalized it at this point. But what is also fascinating with respect to violence is, I think, in American society, I've lived here now more than I have in my society of origin, we have, I had never realized to what a great degree racism has become a part of the American identity. That to me was a surprise, especially, with the Republican response, with the January 6 events and the inability of our legal system to do anything about it. And I think, given the insights I have from my work in the Global South, if you do not acknowledge the collective violence you commit against minorities in the past, you will not be able to have democracy in the society. And if you think about that, there are two foundational violences of American society we have to attend to. The first is the violence against Native Americans for plundering all their lands. And then the second is, of course, against African Americans for exploiting their labor for centuries. I did a very neoliberal calculation, and if we are supposed to compensate them, you know how much we have to pay each Native American? $240 million, and each African American, $3 million. That puts things in perspective when you think about how we nickel and dime them instead and make them into victims. Make them into, perpetrators when they are actually have been victims for centuries, and we do not seem to be able to handle that. That, to me, demonstrates we don't have critical self-reflexivity as a nation, and as a consequence, we cannot see our weaknesses and faults. So this is my 2 cents. Do you want to open it up? Or you want
I
to say
would like,
something?
just to say a little bit. One of the things that this conversation really highlights is that oppression is interconnected and they're related to one another. My foray into looking at sexual harassment as an academic topic was Anita Hill Clarence Thomas. And looking at the ways in which her experience was raced and gendered, and these were two powerful people, but it was always relative. And that, and I listened to the response of the Black community. I listened to the national response, and I was stunned by the lack of understanding of some dynamics that felt really rudimentary to me, and the ways in which her being a Black woman, him being a Black man were really essential to the way the harassment played out, to the impact of it, to the dynamics of silence, to the willingness to engage in this betrayal of her, because historically we have not believed Black women could be sexually assaulted. Their rape was profitable for so long in this country. I mean, just all of these dynamics and components that we refused to talk about in those moments and in the decades since. A lot of my original work was on racialized sexual harassment, and seeing one of the things we know is that in an environment where there is one form of harassment, there will be others, because that is part of the system, the way it's working. And so then when you look at the intersected experience, that means women of color are having high rates of racial harassment and high rates of sexual harassment, and unique types of harassment that are combining the two in ways that don't get captured by racial harassment measures or understandings, nor do they get captured by sexual harassment measures and understandings, because it is intersected. And so as we extend that, then we see, when we look at campus surveys, we're seeing that our trans students are having a uniquely horrible experience in our institutions. That our gay and lesbian students, uniquely horrible experiences within our institutions. And then when you look at those that are students of color and trans, students of color, gay and lesbian, it's being compounded. And it's because we have a culture that says this is okay, that these are the throwaways of society. These are the people that don't quite count and don't quite matter. And so this is the ways in which we're experiencing individual betrayals that are then supported and substantiated and expanded by institutional betrayals, but that also really reflect a national conversation and a devaluing that represents this larger betrayal that we've been, we have a reckoning that has been 400 years in the making and longer in this country. And so as we're having these conversations, in some ways it's so much easier to talk about it, like what do we do to remediate an individual case, than perhaps expand it to how do we address it in a department, in an institution. But really, we're going to require a truth and reckoning that's on a much larger level to see really substantive change.
Thank you. NiCole, you want to add?
Yeah, it just makes me think about all of the ways that I've seen these conversations derail in the past. And because these harms are intersectional, what you often see, what I've often seen, is you'll have a group of people who are really, really interested in addressing, for example, gender-based violence. But then, when people start to talk about how it intersects with other types of oppression, they start to point out other things that are happening on the campus that are more commonplace, that are considered more socially acceptable, but are so inextricably woven with this gender-based bias. And so I'm thinking in particular of a group of actually feminist scholars that I saw having conversations about should we strip awards from people in this discipline who we know have committed acts of sexual violence. And then when the conversation turned into something broader of, well, is sexual violence, when it's so closely tied to exploitation of academic labor, that's when the discussion broke down. Because then you had a number of scholars who were in this group of, self-described feminist scholars who met that definition of having exploited specifically women of color who had worked with them in the past and worried about, well, will I lose my piece of power? And so something that Jennifer said really resonated with me, that a lot of these people who are betraying are not necessarily coming from a place of malice, but they are thinking, wow, I really want to protect myself. If we expand this policy so much, I can think about one thing I did 5 years ago that would fit under that policy. And I think one of the things we need to get comfortable with to make lasting change is recognition that we've all had some degree of complicity. And that's not to flatten things. That's not to say that therefore nobody should be held accountable because we've all participated in some way, but to recognize that in these conversations, especially as they become more transformative, there are moments when all of us will feel a bit called out, and that it's important. One thing I see derailing these conversations all the time is then that want to protect the self, that want to protect others, and then a complete change of subject from the original goals. And that's something that I think anybody involved in these proceedings has to be prepared for and has to be thinking about, is when will I put myself into that space of empathizing with a perpetrator, into that space of trying to slow down progress, and how can I make sure I'm not going to end up in that camp, and I'm instead going to hold myself and my colleagues more accountable for some really broad changes that, yes, if we can eradicate these types of violence on our campuses will look hugely different, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Thank you. Do you want to comment? Yes, 1 hour and we're done. Okay, so shall we open the floor up discussion? Okay, here.
Hello again, thank you. I have noticed like a theme in these conversations surrounding like carceral justice, and specifically like reactionary responses to crime at large, and especially when we're talking about who is going to be most impacted by police violence and violence in the legal system. I'm curious if you all have thoughts on, how transformative justice or restorative justice could actually be implemented in these spaces, and maybe how we reframe these conversations around like being afraid of the consequences of having done something wrong.
Wow, that's a cool question. Okay, who's taking it on? NiCole, are you starting? Which NiCole?
Either.
Either NiCole.
NiCole, you can go first.
I have a couple of thoughts, but I will say that was a great question with a lot of nuance that I would like time to think more on. But one of the things, if we were to transform our thinking about what justice looks like, that would actually go nicely in line with what most survivors want. And this is the part that's often overlooked. We can easily typecast survivors. They're this castrating all the things that will go along with that. And it serves as a way of diminishing the humanity of the people involved. And it becomes much easier to then dismiss their concerns when we do this. But if you talk to many survivors, their first desire is, I want this to never be able to happen again, right? It's a collective desire for healing and for hope and for change that protects the global community, right? And when you even get to the nitty-gritty of what do you want to happen to this person, and this varies widely and often varies based on how horrendous the experience actually was and whether they see the person as having the potential for change. But often when I'm talking to survivors, they would love to see a path for the perpetrator to heal whatever led to them engaging in this behavior. And so, and that may involve a punishment for some period of time, but they're often most desiring that there be a path for that person to reform and never engage in the behavior again. And so those desires align most clearly with transformative justice and restorative justice. So if we are really listening to the desires of survivors, and if we are committed to creating a change in society where healing occurs, there's a group called MAPS, and one of their goals is a net zero trauma for 2070, and that's going to require that we really change our approach to what happens when these acts occur, and that we're looking more for transformative and restorative justice, and we're looking at ways where we can actually create true healing. And I think any of us who have worked with a survivor that goes through any of our current justice systems, those systems often are as traumatizing or sometimes more traumatizing than the original event. So our current carceral system, our current justice system is unjust and is not in line with what most survivors desire in the process. So we need to consider really radical transformations and changes.
Thank you. You want to add?
I would love to.
Okay, go for it.
I agree with all of this, and I also think that there's some important considerations around co-optation. That there are a lot of universities that are rushing to transformative justice and what they're calling restorative justice that bears no resemblance to what these proceedings are supposed to actually look like. And a lot of them are, again, sort of doubling down on trying to just make sure they're confusing restorative justice with saying we will not actually do anything to the perpetrator. We are going to look for inaction instead. And so what's really crucial is to center survivors in these proceedings. And what I've found most helpful is thinking about a lot of the foundational text by abolitionist scholars, Black feminist scholars in particular, that really try to decouple this idea from consequences and punishment. So punishment is something that's going to cause harm as a form of deterring this, whatever this act was in the future, and saying, we're just gonna make it so painful for you that we hope you'll never do it again. And social scientists know very clearly this does not work, not at all, and that it just creates suffering for the sake of suffering. On the other hand, consequences are things that will provide a tangible benefit, especially to the victims involved or potential victims in the future. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, punishment would be something like ostracizing someone from society or giving them a demotion or giving them less pay just for the sake of causing pain. Whereas consequences would be something like saying, well, when you're in this position, you hold a position of power that we have recognized we can't trust you with. And unless we were to see a change in your behavior, which I have more to say on that, so I'll come back to that, we don't think you can be in this position of power right now. So for example, we're going to take you out of a chair position for your department, where you have more control over the trajectories of faculty and students within this department. Or we're going to remove you from a leadership position. Or in some cases, yes, we're going to remove you from the institution as a whole because we can't trust you with the connections that we give at this institution. We can't trust you to be safe around other people. But the goal here isn't about we're trying to harm the perpetrator in some way. The goal is specifically what will be most protective for other members of the community. So it's a completely different paradigm about thinking of these things. The other thing I'll say is about this change. One of the things that I'm a bit hesitant about with this current moment is I think all of us, survivors included, do say that they would prefer to see change. But there is not yet an evidence-based way to ensure that change will take place in perpetrators' ideologies, in large part because our social institutions still reward them for that perpetration. For example, a very common sanction for a faculty member who has been found responsible of sexual misconduct is to get a promotion to a dean level of a university so that they no longer interact with students face-to-face as much, right? And so in that context, it's hard to believe that any of these educational pathways that show promise are going to be so effective because they're undermined by the institution itself. And so that's something that moving forward I'm thinking a lot about, is in this interim period where the educational measures we have we know are ineffective or harmful, what can we do in the meantime to remove structural power from people who may not be willing to change?
Wonderful, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating conversation. And I remember one time offering a graduate seminar on exactly this topic. And so I was guilty as a professor of graduate students with graduate seminars of picking something I wanted to learn about, and knowing that if I put a bunch of smart people in the room and we read something together, I would learn from it. And I was just, so troubled by the problem of justice in this domain. And the whole term, we just read everything we could on different justice systems and so on. And we had people, practitioners, who were come in and talk to us. And I was left at the end somewhat frustrated that didn't feel that we'd really solved the problem. And one of the issues that kept coming up was this sense of, and I really like that definition you gave about the difference between punishment and consequences. But the sense that restorative justice, transformative justice works best, or maybe can only work, according to some, if you've got a perpetrator who actually is willing to acknowledge they did the thing. And, the Darbo response is just like totally not doing that. And one of the things that, I did take away from some of the readings was there is something you can do with the community, even if you have a perpetrator you cannot trust to be sincerely taking responsibility. And that sort of relates to institutional betrayal and institutional courage, because perpetrators are operating inside larger systems, and people are colluding with that perpetrator, knowingly or not. And so maybe one thing you really can do with restorative and transformative justice is get the community to take responsibility for their part in having, turned a blind eye when this thing was going on. So I sort of see more hope there there are some perpetrators who sincerely will take responsibility and don't want to continue doing it, but there are many who won't. But it seems one still could hope that the community, that you could work with the community that way. The other thing I want to say is that, I already commented, I don't think punishment tends to work for much at all, other than giving people who are feeling fury a kind of short-term, the relief of revenge. And it's very short-term and doesn't make the world a better place, but it's a human reaction and it gets indulged. But I worry that it's not just our formal justice system, but there's a huge amount of this going on in our culture where people rush to shame. And I think there's been a real problem with social media in particular, where and the problem with this is it shuts down conversation. Because if a person, like what you're describing, NiCole, of we've all done things that caused harm to others. We've all done things that were racist and sexist and discriminatory on other dimensions. It's just impossible to, unless you're like a baby, to not have done one of these things. And one of the things we need to do is give people space to still be a good person and understand they've done harmful things. And we live in a culture where that's really hard. If you have a conversation with people and you want to talk about sexual harassment, which has a huge spectrum of behaviors, including behaviors that for some people they grew up thinking that was the way it was okay to be, and now they're learning why that's not okay, and they tell you they did this thing, and then the room pounces on them, that shuts down a conversation. if you can create a space where people can say, you know, for years I would tell these jokes, and now I'm thinking, oh, I was probably doing some harm with these jokes. And the people in the room could embrace you for that, that would change it. But that's not the culture we're in right now. We're in the culture right now that's so punitive. Never mind the justice system, just culturally. So I think that one of the shifts we need to make is give people space to grapple with, you know, what they've done, what they've thought, and not just chew them up, because it sends everyone underground when we chew people up.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you, everyone. So I come from a very STEMmy field, statistics. The part of my job that's so wonderful in faculty governance is to explore these spaces and hear from such intelligent individuals. It was brought up earlier that the University of Michigan has this brand new ethics, get it right, ethics, integrity, and compliance office. And it seems like every time these things come about, the C word comes up, compliance. And I know it came up in the talk that it seems to be a challenge for everyone in the space, whether you're coming into the system or you're running the system, that compliance gets in the way. I'm just curious the thoughts all you have on this idea of compliance and where it fits into the system that we have.
It's tricky because I do think that we fail to comply with things we should comply with. But an awful lot, besides the problem I already talked about of the compliance mindset problem, but you know, another problem is that there's lots of bad policies and lots of bad laws. And I think it's really important to give people a space to explore ethics and integrity that is not about compliance whatsoever. You know, there's the concept of the conscientious objector, of a person who recognizes that something should not be complied with. And ideally, we live in a world where we don't have to be conscientious objectors, where we are comfortable with the rules and we can be law-abiding and policy-abiding humans. But we don't live in that world. And I think we each have the responsibility to evaluate, are the policies we've been told we have to follow, are we comfortable following them? I mean, think back to the Nuremberg trials and, you know, the excuse, I was just doing what I was ordered to do. And we now don't think that's an acceptable excuse. At times we think that, other times we think it is. But I would say it's not. I mean, I think it's all, you know, that while I very much want to be law-abiding and live in a law-abiding world, that I still have the responsibility to always be questioning, is this right? And not to do something just because it's the rule. An example is mandatory reporting. I strongly feel mandatory reporting is a travesty and can do terrible harm to individuals. And you know, there's a case where I think that people are often justified in not complying with mandatory reporting rules at their institutions, because there's a more important set of values, ethics, and integrity and duties that override that particular kind of rule. Fortunately, that, you know, you don't go to prison for not, well, in one state you might, but not Michigan. Is it this state?
New state law.
Okay, then it's not the only state that I think, I'm trying to remember if it was Texas or somewhere, there was another one. Yeah, I mean, okay, that's a case where that carceral state really has intruded on cultural things. But yeah, I mean, I think that if you could have an office of ethics and integrity without compliance, that would be healthier.
Well, and I just wanted to add, when we think about the harms, and mandated reporting was the first thing that came to my mind as well. We can't avoid that in this conversation. But one of the things that I think perhaps resonates with institutions more, that we often don't end up getting to. We can very easily understand how mandated reporting is harmful on that individual level. And we need to have more analysis and discussion of how it harms the institution if we want the institution to get buy-in to change. And the idea that you're creating a climate where those disclosures don't ever happen, which actually leaves the campus more dangerous because you have no awareness of what's happening or mechanism for intervening. As well as, I think often institutions need the business case of like, let's count the dollar and cents that you're paying for creating a campus where this is occurring. So yeah, I think we also need to be thoughtful about how these policies are harming the institution and how do we have the conversation with institutions at that level. Because sadly, I think, you know, as you said, the institution can't love you. That also often means they don't really care much about those individual harms, unfortunately.
Oh boy, on that very sobering note. NiCole, do you have to add anything to the other NiCole?
I mean, I have plenty to say about compliance. We called our consulting forum Beyond Compliance because we're so frustrated by this compliance rhetoric, especially because I just want to highlight that the bar for what's considered compliant with the law is exceptionally low. There's this concept in sociology called symbolic compliance, and it was developed to explain why even though race discrimination had been illegal in higher education for decades, it's still very commonplace in higher education and has been applied to sex discrimination in Title IX as well. And one of the things that the researchers found was that judges had a tendency to see any attempt to be compliant as compliance itself. And so one of the things we end up with a lot, you know, talking about bad policy as an example, but it's policies that we know are ineffective. And we know they're not doing anything. We know they're causing harm. But many judges will think that as long as there is a Title IX office, doesn't matter if it's staffed, doesn't matter if it's doing good work, doesn't matter how many students are benefited by it, if any, that alone is enough. So when we talk about a compliance office, I do just want to make really clear that the bar is in the ground for what that could possibly mean when symbolic compliance is the norm, especially in higher education spaces in comparison to other spaces. The regulations around Title IX in particular, they're just really vague. And this is a big part of my academic work, actually, is about how anything that's vague or too overly complicated for the general public to understand gives institution powers to truly do whatever they would want. And we're in a moment right now around Title IX in particular where institutions really are doing whatever they want because they have complete control and they can self-govern. They have these policies that are so vague or ambiguous that no one outside of the institution can understand them. And so unless someone, an institutional insider, an institutional whistleblower takes a special interest in your case, you can't actually make it through the Title IX process. And you certainly won't have the information to be able to convince most lawyers to take your case if your Title IX rights have been violated because they can't understand this stuff either. So one of the things that I'm really wishing that we would focus on a lot more is instead of thinking about would a lawyer think that this policy looks good, would a judge think this policy looks good, is something really simple. Would we think that the victims affected would be benefited from this policy? Would it help them or not? Would it hurt them or not? And let that guide a lot of our institutional decision making. Because here's the thing. All of that vagueness, all of that ambiguity does allow institutions to take on a bigger role if they wanted to. And that's the part that I'd like to see us challenging the institutions we inhabit to do, is to do more, to not be so focused on compliance, and instead to say, you know what, we want to be a place where sexual violence doesn't happen. And I haven't heard many universities that are saying that specific thing, that we want to end this type of discrimination.
Thank you, NiCole. And
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what you're saying, that a danger too with compliance as a leading motivator for universities is it's a great distraction tool, because what universities do is they make compliance laborious and absurd. And it's almost like you enter this Orwellian world where you are filling out forms and taking little online videos and jumping through hoops, and you realize it's stupid and it's wrong, which then breeds cynicism about the whole thing, and potentially even breeds cynicism about the purpose of it. Where I first started thinking about this was actually in a slightly different domain, and that's the protection of human participants in research. So, there was a time there was no protections in place, and researchers could do anything they want, and they did terrible things. And so the federal government commissioned a report and required that there be federal oversight for any research for which federal dollars are involved. And universities eventually had these offices called IRBs, Internal Review Boards, and researchers go through a whole lot of rigmarole dealing with IRBs, and any of you who are researchers know what I'm talking about. The bureaucracy has grown and grown and grown, and there's nothing to really stop it from growing and growing and growing. The underlying principle, and there was a report commissioned that's beautiful, it's called the Belmont Report, that has underlying principles about respecting autonomy and beneficence and equity. Beautiful principles. But the bureaucracy that has grown around this compliance, it's Orwellian, and it's incredibly stupid, and it interferes with your freedom of speech and your academic freedom, and it wastes your time.
And the IRB says if you get hurt, it's your insurance that has to pay.
Yes. So it's made, compliance actually makes it worse in this situation. It's not just that the bar's too low, it's that it actually is making the situation worse. And it shouldn't, but the way it's been implemented, the devil in the details, it is counterproductive.
I totally agree. I mean, and in my case, for example, I was doing a study with the Kurds in Turkey, whom I knew well because obviously I work on minorities, and here I am having these conversations with the IRB person who's never met a Kurd or seen one probably, and then they're asking about how am I going to be protecting them or this or that and the other thing, and I do that anyhow as an academic. I don't need their approval of what I'm doing, and I just finished those tests you have to take online. Most of them have to deal with the medical profession. I mean, do you give insulin now or then or whatever? It has nothing to do with me at all in the social sciences on top of it. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I guess I would love your thoughts on how do we operationalize accountability given all these problems with compliance. So, when you're talking about your institutional courage questionnaire, I'm like, oh, we could turn that into a scorecard where we rate universities and see if they're meeting these different things, but then does that just make the rules of the game clear to them so that they can immediately start to try to game the rules? So how do we say things like what is measured is what counts, and giving people really concrete steps of how to change their structures seems helpful, and once you do that, are you just creating this paradox with compliance issues?
You want?
I mean, that's a great question. I worry about it. I mean, I think one thing to realize is this is an ever-changing process. So any given measure, any given test can be gamed. But if one is constantly revising it based on first principles, that's less of a problem. So, yeah, I mean, one of the ways people have often said we should address, campus sexual assault is basically a consumer approach where a single measure is used for every campus that is administered, by some third party, and then you get a scorecard across campuses. Any given measure would vary in quality, but as soon as it's been around for a couple of years, it would be subject to this particular problem. So I think it's a good idea to have, a measure that's consistent across universities and to share the results. Actually, it's a good idea, but you'd want to design it from the get-go that the process of creating it was always rooted in the first principles, what it is you're really trying to measure, and then a constant revision process. Every year, you're going to have to change it so that it doesn't become stale. And I mean, going back to the IRB thing again, I think some things do need to be regulated, and I think the behavior of researchers in some domains does need to be regulated, but it needs to be thoughtful. We need to figure out where does this regulation need to occur, and then each time go back to, in this case, the Belmont report and say, are we doing this in a way that's sensible? And the same thing, you know, with institutional betrayal and courage and sexual assault. It's got to be thoughtful and constantly revised, which is a lot of work, but that's the way, you know, things that are important we work at.
I think the compliance has to go both ways. I think it shouldn't only keep the PIs, you know, principal investigators. The unit administering it also has to have compliance and accountability for what it is doing. I think part of our problem is bureaucracy is like becomes this iron cage, as we say in sociology, and in a way, once you're in it, when even if you make a mistake or you're at fault, you don't follow through, whatever, they constantly silence it and whitewash it, so that in the end, you do not, nobody gets punished. I mean, or at least nobody gets to account for what they have done to you. You cannot hold anyone accountable for what has happened to you. That is the problem. And that is a problem of the bureaucracy. I mean, we really have to study the administration as a bureaucratic unit to see what the weaknesses in it are and come up with ways, I think, you mean smaller committees with faculty on it, whatever, that would transform the bureaucracy, because they're not capable of transforming themselves. They're capable only of reproducing themselves because of the way they approach everything. At least that's my 2 cents. You have 2 cents?
Well, one of the things that occurred to me in your question is that in some ways what you're getting at is also the need for culture shift and culture change, where we are actually valuing the underlying tenets and the kind of the first principles. Are we getting at the desire that NiCole, you mentioned, of we don't want this to be a place where this is happening, and then we allow that to guide what we're doing and the policies we're making, versus we want to be able to tick the boxes to, you know, send the report off to the federal government. And the drive for compliance has definitely done that. And so looking at things that are actually measuring culture and climate, and those are a little bit more difficult to game, because you're getting them from this wider group of people. But yeah, then we get into the will of the institution. Is this where they're willing to put their time and energy? I think we've seen that's often not the case. NiCole, did you?
I just want to echo what everyone was saying about accountability of the institution as well. It's hard to hold individuals within the institution accountable if the institution itself is not accountable. And so I want to echo what other people have said all along, which is this conflict of interest where universities can let their own concerns about risk management, about protecting themselves and their most prestigious people, right? There are certain very high esteemed professors or donors. In my research, I find the children of those professors and donors are perpetrating violence at exceptionally high rates because they're beyond reproach. And I have had a lot of optimism thinking about, there are a few places in the US that are starting to think about how to remove this conflict of interest and how to hold the institution accountable. I gave testimony in support of a bill which passed in the state of California to move victim advocacy offices. They're still on college campuses, but they are now staffed by independent employees who report directly to the state instead of to the university. And explicitly in that law, one of the things they wanted victim advocates to be able to do was help students file civil lawsuits against their university if their Title IX rights have been violated. That is a very different scenario than what we're thinking about right now, and it would change the incentive structure pretty significantly. I agree with what other people have said, that having those external third-party evaluators is really crucial for making sure that there isn't that tug on everybody of we want what's best for the school because that's going to be best for my position within the school, right? Before we'll have a chance to have this kind of larger agency created or something like that, I think some interim things that can be helpful is to have things like regular audits, is to make more of what's happening within Title IX offices public, to pass laws that require that it's public, which exist in places like New York and Maryland. And that can go a long way into at least equipping the general public with the ability to join the conversation. Whereas right now in most schools in most states, they're just sort of watching it and they're horrified by what's going on and they have no idea where to start. And it would mean a lot if more people that were involved in this conversation were coming from that perspective of just a concerned citizen who wants this type of violence to end.
Thank you so much. And we have time for one last question. Who's going to ask the last question? Yes? Oh, come on. Okay, go ahead. Yes, perfect.
Unless someone else has.
No, nobody has their hands. So I was going to call them.
Okay. Well, this is just really, it's really been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to dinner. What I was going to say kind of follows up on what our SACUA chair, Tom Braun, asked about compliance. And having been on Faculty Senate and SACUA, and I'm secretary I'm in my 5th year, and I'm just watching as we have been able to shepherd these changes through the university system. I was part of a subcommittee where we worked with Elizabeth Armstrong and all. So this is all coming out of Faculty Senate work. But when you talk about compliance, I'm starting to feel like, here come the brakes, okay. And this is our chance. You know, we have a president. We wanted a president who would do this, but now we still need to be able to advise him and his office. And I'm just thinking, what can we do? I mean, if this was the last chance we had, because we have had some, you know, issues, but I was just taking notes about the state that you mentioned, helping to pay people, pay for students, and it's not just students. We find that graduate students and staff are some of the most vulnerable people to sexual abuse and harassment. So I just wondered, you've already said a couple things, but I'm just concerned about if this is our last chance to really have some accountability, how can we advise our administration in the way to go? Because they're looking toward us, I think.
You said it a minute ago. Look at Oregon. Right? I mean, that's something you said when I asked you a question, because the biggest issues here in terms of compliance and mandatory accounting and everything may be things that Oregon really has dealt with.
Yeah, what is being referred to here specifically is a mandatory reporting non-policy, or it's a policy, but it's not mandatory reporting that we were able to get through at Oregon. This is at the University of Oregon. It's called mandatory supporting, and faculty and staff are required to do what the student wants them to do. Essentially, if the student wants it to go up, you know, to a more official report, that faculty and staff has to help them if that's what the student wants, and if not, then the faculty and staff has to respect their privacy. There's other requirements like providing the student with a central website address and some training in how to be supportive, and the faculty staff member has to call a certain number to make have a confidential discussion just to make sure they've done it right. So it's doable, and this is can be a model for other institutions. It's one of the things that helped us get this passed was we had a law professor as part of our working group who wrote a law review article showing that this kind of policy was better for the institution, which goes to a point about, you have to convince the institution it's in their interest too, because they don't care about the individual. But it is better for them too. And so that's an example where it can be fixed. And I think having a good mandatory or good reporting policy goes a long way. But the other thing I want to say specifically to your question, if I was going to make one easy to implement recommendation to pass on to a president, is that president make a commitment to, on some regular basis that gets spelled out, maybe it's once a month, honor a truth teller. With that truth teller's permission, some truth tellers are not going to want this to happen, but truth tellers that are happy to be publicly honored, and that president send a message out to the whole campus honoring this person, and make it the culture to honor people that are telling difficult truths. I think that would make a lot of change pretty quickly.
No, I forgot to mention, I think ours is our outside people will be the regents. I think I just got nervous and forgot. But I think as we for looking for an outside accountability. I think the regents, the Board of Regents, were going to be our outside accountability, to whom the president reports and so on. So, and the regents had been on our side for this change and so I guess maybe it won't be as dire as I was thinking, but these are some great recommendations, especially the mandatory supporting as opposed to reporting. That's
One more point, just to say, there is one pivotal article that was written by 2 University of Michigan people and me. The first author is she's now a assistant or associate professor at the University of Nebraska, but she was a graduate student here named Catherine Holland, went by Katie Holland. She was first author. Second author is Lilia Cortina, who's a professor here, and I was the third author, and it's called Compelled Disclosure. It was published in the sort of flagship journal for the American Psychological Association, where we trace the sort of, the data, what universities are doing, and the psychological data about these issues. And I find it hard to believe that anyone could read this article and not want to change their policy, but I can be naive that way. There was then published commentary about it, and we had a follow-up response to some of that commentary where we talked specifically about the Oregon policy. So anyone who wants that, it's all on my website, but you can also email me and I can send you a link.
Thank you. One comment about regents is that the regents are very important, of course, but they're elected by the people, and their priorities usually are not the educational system or knowledge production. They are much more into businesses, laws, politics. I mean, and their priorities in this neoliberal capitalist system that we live in are mostly financial. And that has been a very terrible way to decide on things, because educational institutions are counter-economic. They do not, run by the same. So maybe it's the combination of the president and the regents would be a better solution than just going with the regents or with the president. Yeah. You want to say?
I would like to say, if you're thinking about things to recommend, at MSU, Rebecca Campbell, myself, and Katie Gregory, and a couple of additional people worked on a campaign called the Support More campaign. And there's resources that you can go to, and really the goal was to change the culture of the institution and really being able to make it so that all of us, whether you talked to support staff or faculty or to another student, that there was knowledge about how to actually be supportive to a survivor and how to respond in that moment. And a couple of the pieces of it was making it clearer to everyone who is a mandated reporter and who are the offices where they are protected from that requirement. So, and making sure that staff were quick to make that very clear. What is their role? That we identified the offices where students could talk confidentially without that triggering a report. So kind of a blend of these are the people that are kind of more of the mandated supporter model. I love that model, by the way. But again, if you're going to have this requirement stay in place, how do we empower individuals to make the choice of who they're then talking to about their experience so that they are not put into this situation where it's being reported against their will? But yeah, we have resources. We have a paper that we're submitting on the process, but you could go to the website and look at some of those resources. But that was a way of how do we create the climate change and the culture change and provide information to people about the resources that are available, how do you access them, actually giving people language. What might you actually say in response to a student that just gave you a disclosure? Because often we found, not to pick on statistics, but the statistics or mathematics professors were like, I don't know what I would say in that moment, and I have nothing in my background to prepare me for this disclosure. So giving people the language, giving people example, and really trying to focus in on how do we make the entire environment one that's more supportive.
NiCole?
The other thing that comes to mind for me, I want to echo all of this. This is all right on about how to make sure the reporting experience is something that survivors have control over and how to make sure it's a more positive experience. But the other thing that I want to pull out is that there's a reason that practitioners like us don't recommend mandatory reporting. And one of the reasons for that is that because the Title IX process itself is so re-traumatizing for survivors. And so one of the main reasons it's so traumatizing, we have the process itself, that's sort of a broader separate conversation. But one of the more proximate issues that survivors refuse to report or are fearful to report is because they're worried about retaliation. And that's something I think that more schools should be thinking about, is better anti-retaliation policy. A lot of schools, I don't know Michigan's policy that well anymore, but a lot of schools' anti-retaliation policy just comes down to a single sentence that says, don't do this, that this is prohibited. And then if that retaliation policy is, if it's violated in some way, what schools will do is say, we're going to open a separate investigation into whether or not retaliation occurred, but we're just going to put this off until we're done with the initial investigation. And that's really problematic for a whole host of reasons. First of all, it still allows a perpetrator in particular to continue to meddle in an investigation, which means the efficacy of the first investigation is completely compromised. It's creating harm for the survivor who's sort of expected to just endure this retaliation. And it has this implicit understanding that the university thinks that, well, whether or not we think this retaliation is appropriate depends on the outcome of our investigation. And if we decide that there's insufficient evidence in this case, then we're going to treat this the same as a false allegation and say that the retaliation is totally merited. And that's a culture shift that needs to change. Retaliation should always be considered unacceptable. Frankly, no matter what the outcome of the original investigation or informal process might be, there's a lot of informal proceedings happening now too. The vast majority of these cases are handled informally now. But there needs to be a sense that retaliation is never acceptable and it needs to be taken very seriously. I would actually argue the order in which these things are done should be reversed, and the retaliation proceeding should take precedent over the other investigation for many of the reasons that Jennifer said during her talk, which is this is something we can see happening right in front of us, and it deserves, it merits consequences no matter what. This is violating a policy. But the other thing I want to do is talk about this broader cultural shift around the burdens that we put on survivors to come forward, that we basically tell them the reason they're so vulnerable to retaliation is because our universities look the other way when this type of violence is happening in plain sight. And we say, unless the victim is going to make a big deal out of it, and then, put that in big quotes, that's the way they think about it, that the university would prefer to just ignore the violence that takes place. I was really stunned. For my dissertation, I spent a year at one university and I interviewed victims, perpetrators, and administrators. I oversaw very many Title IX cases during this time. And I was stunned by how many of them happened in public in front of faculty and or staff who could have been the ones to initiate something. And I just want to say that this is like different than mandatory reporting, right? It's this idea of, I would like us to think about what it would look like to protect survivors by retaliation by saying the university is going to create a cultural shift where we don't want this to happen and we're going to take action. And we're not, in cases where it happened publicly and we saw it and the facts are not in dispute at all, we're going to take that action and a victim doesn't have to participate. We're not going to waste your time. We're not going to exhaust you. We're not going to re-traumatize you. And it's going to shift the frustration from how dare this individual victim report to, oh, it's the school that has this broader culture and this is the way that they're responding. I can't think of any schools that are taking this exact approach, which for an immediate, if this is our last chance attempt to do something, we often do want a clear model to point to. But I do think it's something that Lilia and Cortina and I had spoken about in the alumni magazine for Michigan in the past. And I think it's something we should seriously consider is how do we make it clear that this is a university goal, if in fact it is, as opposed to sort of a thorn in the university side, which is the way that these reports are treated right now.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for that, and to all our audience for attending this amazing transformative event. May this be the beginning of very significant changes at the University of Michigan, given the wisdom that you all three shared going forward. And thank you all for participating, especially you, Jennifer. And it's good to know that there is a lot of work that's been done that could help move us forward. So thank you for putting this together, University of Michigan Senate. Take care and thank you.